And here we are. Welcome to the Lobster Pot podcast, aka day 2 of the Product Earth Seminar Zone, something like that. But anyway, we're giving people who didn't have the chance to give their presentations the chance to do that now. So without further ado, here we have Jessica Steinberg. Good to see you, Jessica. How are you doing? You all right?
It's great to be here. So glad that we have another chance to run through these.
Absolutely. And you work in your consultancy is called the Global C. Is that right?
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So I have a doctorate from the University of Oxford in law, where I was looking at the legalization and commercialization of cannabis, now focused on legal work and regulatory work under the Global C. Excellent.
And tell us your topic for today. It sounds rather ambitious, but let's go with it. Tell us more.
All right. So the topic is cannabis in society and anthropological exploration.
Okay, cool. And you're going to do that in 10 minutes? We're good, yeah? Because there's a lot to cover in 10 minutes, but, you know, I'm excited to learn more.
I'm going to walk you guys through a little snapshot of my conclusion, some of my conclusions in my thesis.
That's cool.
And we'll leave it there, and perhaps there's more to talk about later on.
Perfect. All righty. Well, over to you then. And yeah, thank you very much.
All righty. Thanks so much. Yeah, so I'm going to tell you guys a story about cannabis and society. And one of the things that really comes out in this is when we think, it raises a question. What happens when values meet value? Or in other words, what happens when purpose meets profit? So a lot of us in the cannabis industry came into this with a very strong why. Our motivations are fueled by morality, and we have a moral compass. There's policymakers and patients. And you can see very clearly that the purpose is at the core, even from when it was very counterculture moving into the mainstream. And then we have something more mainstream, the value, the profit. We have profit-minded individuals, we have the stock market, we have company valuations. And it starts to really raise a question of, well, what happens when those two things and this web begins to interrelate and engage, and is there tension, and what does that tension really look like? And so this started to make me think, well, we can look at it like a web, and I introduced this concept of the market and the movement connection. We know there's a social movement. We know a lot of us refer to being professionals in the cannabis market as well. And so this is really intertwined in a complex web. On the one hand, it reflects the past. At the same time, it's mirroring goals to refigure the present. And then each of us, as we're actively constructing and engineering this, we are influencing the future. So we have this prism of processes, there's places and people, there's connections, but at the same time, what happens when these values meet value? It does seem like there are fragmentation. But is that fragmentation really an enemy of reform? Is that friction stopping us from moving into commercialization, moving into further degrees of legal reform? And in principle, we can look at if there's this moral judgment, this pull for social justice, or if really at the root of what's driving this all is just people primarily motivated by money. So those motivated by money, those motivated by something more moral, we would think, boom, friction, fragmentation. Okay, but here we are. There's something more in this where we can find freedom in that. And there's something really beautiful about the way that the cannabis industry has unfolded in this dynamic of change. It's embedded in a historical residue with this counterculture and the war on drugs, criminalization. But then we have people who come at it with moral visions and commitment. So on the one hand, as we start to come together, there's forces that bring out a homogenization. We start to exist in an echo chamber. You go to cannabis conferences and people start to use the same terminology, and we start to think about how can we legalize this? How can we move it forward? But at the same time, our differences really begin to become highlighted. There's a heterogeneous element of the way the companies are operating, that corporate culture ethos and things like that. And so I like to draw out this friction and the fragmentation in an analogy. As often we do with cannabis, we look to the plant world to understand our own world. And so there's something that many of us will know, a rhizome. A rhizome has non-hierarchical roots and offshoots. They're growing underground in a system, a very beautiful system. Sometimes those get broken. And what happens is that the stem actually proliferates. It's creating new connections for survival and propagation. And we can take a lot to learn from that. because there may be fragility in the way that fragmentation brings out our differences. But essentially, if we look at it and this broken stem actually is creating something, perhaps it's giving us an opportunity to have a collaborative force and highlight what is possible between those who are driven by their values and those who are driven by value. So there's a diagram that I use often where I look at the moral market, market forces, and moral forces. I've spoken much about market forces already. We understand that kind of like corporate culture, the moral forces, where people really have this prominent drive for social justice or human rights and things like that, or something deeply personal to them, and the stories that are really retold. And then there's an organizational theorist who terms this concept of a moral market. Now, I don't think that many of us in the cannabis industry would suggest this term, that the cannabis market is a moral market. But the way the organizational theorists talk about it, they're markets that they exist to create social value. Okay, checkbox. They're typically supported by organized actors. Again, checkbox. And they're motivated by moral or normative considerations, not only a pursuit in economic interest. And so it's interesting when we see that people who were coming into the industry mostly driven by economic motives, oftentimes what happened is their companies or their beliefs start to get very intertwined into the moral compass. Again, perhaps part of that echo chamber. Because again, the only way that we can exist within the cannabis industry is going back to that web that I described. When we think about how the past is reflected in the present, how the present is refiguring where we're moving to, and how we continue to actively construct this. So the way that I look at it, I'm an anthropologist by training. The way that my fieldwork was conducted was over 11 countries in 18 months. So I really focused on the individuals. And people undergo these transformations, and when they start to whether they're coming into that friction or they're moving away from it. And so what I found is that these processes of reform are really dependent on local people, activities, and networks. Now, of course, there's a degree of chance and contingency that happens as all of this unfolds, but people start to have an identity that's born out of a crisis or out of uncertainty. Because the pace at which cannabis is moving, the regulations are changing, the economic stakeholders are also in flux. What happens is that the voices, the stories, the people are the ones who begin to shape the narrative. And all of this exists within a global supply chain. And so I started to think about how do we look at it localizing the global? If people are the ones engineering the narrative and exchanging in the way that we synchronize the markets and the movement, well, then we can look at it, we could see something flying above us in the sky, or we could see it as a bird. We could take a step back and see the ocean, or we could look at the fish and the schools and the networks around all of this. And the difference is what we describe and experience in cannabis, we could compare it to other companies such as Ben & Jerry's or Patagonia. Now, both of these companies do have a degree of marketing around social movements. Patagonia has made quite a few political statements. They also are pretty well known around environmental movements. Ben & Jerry's more akin to our industry, where cannabis, they have really tried to have campaigns around the war on drugs and the criminal justice element of this. But I don't think anybody would disagree if I said that they're not key players or stakeholders within the cannabis industry. Despite people in the cannabis industry having an environmental concern, or Ben & Jerry's actually moving into the cannabis space. Now, the difference that we see here, and this is why I continue to emphasize the local and the individuals, is that you and I and anyone else who is really attending Product Earth as an example, we're committed to this on a daily, regular basis. There's deliberate activity, there's repetition. Versus Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia. They're doing sporadic activity. Maybe it's to boost their stock prices. Who knows? Maybe it's to boost some other sort of conversation around that. So maybe it's economic. Maybe it's also moral. But at the end of the day, when we think about the social movement and the market forces and the moral imperatives, that the way we can triangulate this together, my takeaway in much of my PhD was that we find people who are locally situated and they're globally connected, And what's interesting is that we end up solving for the problem of prohibition. We end up solving for what it's already legal. There's criminalization that has happened. And so instead of trying to solve necessarily and discovering more about that, what we're actively doing on our day-to-day basis in whatever capacity we show up in this industry is we're constructing what post-prohibition means. So what does that look like, again, in that web? And so we can continue to think, okay, it is uncertain, but if we go back to that rhizome analogy, maybe that allows us to think about a way that our diversity and our differences may break off into an offshoot, but it is how we can respond and how we can innovate, that we can take and move and teeter with these rapid changes and reforms. There could be slow development, there could also be stability. So the arrow could go in any one direction. At the end of the day, if it really is about each individual and each person, and we localize that global together, then it's about how we construct this, it's about how we engineer it. And so when I think about cannabis in society, I love to think about that the reason we're here, the reason we can have a conversation like this is because of all of the individuals, the narratives, the stories, and wherever it goes next, it's really in our hands. So it's still a very exciting time. And that's how I'll wrap that up in a very short 10-ish minute snapshot of part of my findings.
Brilliant. And you did cover quite a lot there, which is great. That's fascinating.
Fantastic.
No, there's quite a lot to unpick, and I just want to pick up on a couple of things that I thought were quite interesting, because again, it plays into a lot of the things I suppose I think about the sort of sector as well, in that you kind of have to be an advocate in some ways coming into the sector, whether you are or not to begin with, because straight away sort of feel the sense of stigma, or the kind of, it's not even stigma, sometimes it's, well, I don't know, depending on what you define as stigma. I suppose it's more the kind of, you sense there's a lack of understanding more broadly around certain things. So in order to kind of, you take on board, like you advocate, or you try and educate. I think there's so much information out there. I think once you find that sort of passion, particularly, I mean, this is, I suppose in my case, true. It's kind of, you want to kind of understand as much as you can about it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's quite typical of a lot of people coming into the industry, the business of cannabis?
Yeah, I actually talk a lot about like the self-imposed responsibility that people take on when they enter the industry, especially those who come from like more of the profit-minded individuals. I found it so fascinating because I do think people end up somewhat subconsciously just like regurgitating what they hear essentially, and then advocating for it, because at the end of the day, we're also dealing with a plant that you can see effects with, especially the medical market here in the UK and broadly more in Europe. So I do think people in a somewhat subconscious way, if you and I were to bring it to their attention like you are now, I think they'd be, oh yeah, I do a lot of advocacy, but it's informal. They're like,
yeah, no, absolutely. But again, like you say, the danger of doing that and talking to other people within the sector is that you do end up in this echo chamber. And I think of it as a kind of canna bubble. And it's like, how do you kind of, again, as we kind of move towards, how do we, I mean, I guess one of the biggest things here in the UK is that, we have a nation of 67 million people and something like 40,000, depending on last count, patients, which is absolutely, so insignificant as a percentage. And it's like, well, how do we kind of take, a lot of this advocacy work and kind of get it outside of that canna bubble? Because otherwise we're preaching to the converted, and we all share those perspectives. What's your kind of thoughts on that? I mean, what kind of things have you seen as effective moving outside of the sector that's kind of getting people's attention? Is that one sort of area you've sort of looked at?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is thinking about normalization, destigmatization. I even thought I felt very fortunate to do a PhD on this topic, because I think having that the academic side of it helps to also legitimize, which feeds into those sort of conversations. So I think it comes from like all different angles. There is a part of my thesis where I was talking about, like years ago, there was like an Aussie hair campaign that was using like the hemp plant and stuff like that. And on the one hand, where these big companies that are, again, not part of the cannabis industry, when they start to become so mainstream, there's an awareness shift on the wider public that we can't really touch, because whether it's regulations or capital, whatever it is. But at the same time, that risks the misinformation being spread. And when you think about a cannabis leaf, so it's like, I find it very difficult because I think it's how do you partner almost with like companies or individuals or groups that have that reach? Because I think, especially in the UK, it's about getting into these areas that like people who don't necessarily believe, like you said, like, why are we preaching to the already converted? So sometimes those who have different target markets or audiences is really good. However, I also just found that over time, it's like you have to, the risk is they're spreading information that may be good, but if it's the wrong information, and we know how complicated the industry is and how complicated the plant is, that you have to like unlearn what's being taught and then reteach. So part of it is like, I do think in the industry, it's better suited for like each company or each organization to have like some degree of education. And this, again, back to your point about advocacy, I think a lot of people are both advocates and educators. And in order for us to continue to shift and move into reform, like all of us need to take on that sort of responsibility.
Yeah. And I think the same with again, this is slightly contentious, but again, as we're seeing more sectors kind of diversify into cannabis, particularly around kind of alcohol and tobacco and pharmaceuticals. I mean, CB Expo, I don't know if you've been, this year and last year when I went, I didn't go this year, but last year it was held at the same time as Intertobac in Dortmund. And I remember going, it's kind of, the two things were kind of connected, adjacent, but you could go to one and not the other, basically. But actually going in, seeing the, Intertobac versus the cannabis side, it's like, oh my God, all of a sudden, this is a very different industry. And you can't help but think, well, actually, there's no kind of altruistic reason for tobacco to diversify into cannabis. It's not mission, it is purely profit driven because less people are smoking tobacco. And it's how, and I guess some people are sort of opposed to, well, it kind of makes economic sense. The tobacco, swap one crop for another, you've got the distribution, you've got all of that aspect to it. Both highly regulated sectors, but it's that intent, that I feel has to be part of the cannabis industry still. But do you think that will change as more sectors try to diversify and it becomes more profit driven?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I remember speaking to some patients who kind of had this like love-hate relationship with big pharma or like big tobacco, big alcohol coming into it, especially on the pharma side, because it's like patients need medicine in order to get medicine to be EMP and follow all the certifications and things like that. Like it's very expensive. So it's like, in order for us to have our medicine, they would say like, we need the capital behind us. We do need those. However, then to your point, it's like, okay, but what's their intent? And if it's only profit driven or something like that, then it may, and this is where I do think it's part of the cannabis industry. There's like a rite of passage almost. If you want to do a deal, you also have to understand where we came from. Because and this is kind of what I talk about with like the moral market. Like the only way that people don't end up in these like crazy tense conflicts is if you can understand the past to understand where we are right now, and then to figure out how we go somewhere together. Because again, like it is on the face of it, the intent just clashes. It shouldn't work. And so I think that's where it's like, okay, well, what's the tango between learning and understanding and some degree of curiosity? And maybe that's something that people in the industry demand more of, and kind of like set that up. But it's tricky because it's just, this is where I'm like, I've spoken to a lot of people who suggest the cannabis market and industry, like moving into the mainstream is good. But then what happens when it actually does meet mainstream markets? Like if the intent is just profitability, then does that take away? And maybe the goal is different then.
I feel like, it's going to be under such scrutiny, perhaps more so. I mean, I guess, think about, again, tobacco, coming back to that, it's almost like the ship has sailed, it is, things are the way they are, there is, but cannabis has an opportunity to kind of, it's going to face such increasing amount of scrutiny as it becomes more mainstream, that it can almost be done in the right way, rather than have kind of like neon yellow kind of vapes that children are apparently smoking and so forth. It's like, well, actually, why is that not? Well, it is being regulated, but it's almost after the fact, whereas cannabis has to go through these loopholes in order to kind of have a robust industry that's also exercises a degree of responsibility towards the consumer. And
yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, it may be interesting where the consumer starts to drive some of these regulatory considerations, because I just think a lot of it's like they're always playing catch up. They're
yeah.
being as proactive as they can be. It's always like not always, but it seems to be more reactive than anything.
Yeah.
So.
I suppose it's again, it's such an interesting sector to be involved in, and it's, again, I can never quite get my head around how something that helps children reduce the number of seizures can still be a plant that someone can enjoy on a Saturday night and relax with friends. It's just crazy, but I think, again, that is why it's so fascinating, so interesting, and why it's subject to the kind of scrutiny and that it needs to be. But again,
yeah, it touches so many different people in so many different ways. It's yeah. I'm very curious to see how it all unfolds in the next few years, because it will continue to change, I think.
That's it. I mean, what do you think in terms of legalization recreationally here? What's the sort of timeline? I do ask people this time to time.
Coming at it from probably like a more macro lens, I think there's a lot to figure out in Germany. Not only in cannabis, but in a lot of regulatory aspects, tends to set the precedent for the pace for what's happening in other countries here. So I think there's some things for Germany to figure out first before the UK figures out.
Yeah.
I always come back to, in the UK, there's such a heavy pub culture and such a heavy drinking culture that compared to like in the US, for example, it's just not, it's like apples and oranges.
Yeah.
And I also don't think it's like from a policy perspective, I just don't think it's a priority. I did think post-COVID, there may be more movement because of all the debt we were in.
Right.
Because it's like, again, the economic incentives to legalize and taxes and things like this. But so I don't know. Maybe one day, hopefully in our lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, I always think 8 to 10 years, but I think realistically, we're probably here in the UK 20 years behind maybe some of the more proactive states in the US, like Colorado. And so, yeah, maybe hopefully in our lifetime, but, likely say 10 years. And I feel like that's optimistic, but
yeah, I mean, maybe also if and when the US changes their policies around it at the federal level, things will open up a bit.
That's it. People will, and I think that, I don't know, I would expect Germany to have more of an impact here than perhaps it has. But then I think Germany's still kind of figuring it out. It's still early days, but again, there hasn't been as much kind of, mainstream media hasn't seemed to given that much of a damn about it, to be honest.
No,
it's a whole other topic.
Just to like raise some ruckus or something to get back on the mainstream news.
Absolutely. No, that's cool. I mean, again, no, thank you. Again, some really interesting insights here. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And you finally got to do it. So yay.
I'm so happy. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, it's been great to chat with you. And thank you so much. And look forward to seeing you again. So
absolutely.
See you later. Take care. And I'll stop there.